Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host, researcher, minister, and friend, Charles Paisley, the founder of ChristianGospelChurch.org, and the author of Come Out of Her, My People. Charles, it's good to be back, and we're recording these a bit ahead, so the first episode has gone out, and people are just raving over the content. They're excited to hear more. I've got actually a few communications from different people that have been experiencing some of the areas of the history that we're talking about, and I've got to go through those and share some of that information with you, but the collaboration and the feedback has been quite good. So I'm excited about that. I'm a little bit, I don't know what the word is. I have a lot of mixed emotions about the episode we're going to have today because as you and I have discussed, and I was actually quite public about this, I was really close to Billy Paul. I really liked Billy Paul. And I realized the harm that he did. I realized all of that. But in my mind, in my head, whenever I'm thinking about Billy Paul, I have a lot of fond memories. And it's hard not to when you're in a cult. You become close to some of the leadership. And he had his flaws, I'm going to admit. As we'll talk today, there are quite a few flaws. And he was no... I like to look at him sometimes as an innocent victim in my mind just because it helps me reconcile what happened. But he was not innocent whatsoever. There are some areas of what we're going to talk about today that implicate my grandfather. And people have wanted me for years to open up about what happened at the Branham Tabernacle whenever the most recent split happened and whenever grandfather left the Branham Tabernacle, started his own church, and the rest of the weird history where the core main sect that followed William Branham's other son, Joseph Branham, they started their own church and held it for a bit of time, but I don't know what it's been, Charles, like 2 years now. They don't even open the doors to the church other than special occasions and whatnot. They're not holding services regularly. So there's a lot of weird history. I'm going to open up a bit more than I have in the past because everybody's been asking me to. So this is going to be a difficult podcast for me to do.
Oh, my John, I know just what you mean, because most everyone that we're talking about through this series, we know them. And it's not that we hate these people, honestly. Some of these people that we're talking about, John, they were like grandfathers to me. Like, these were my heroes growing up. You know what I mean? These are the people we wanted to be when we grew up, right? We're talking about our Superman, okay, when we talk about this. So we really loved these people. It wasn't a hate for these people. We deeply loved a lot of these people that we're talking about. And so I hope that people understand that, because that's, I think, in one way, John, how I feel some of the liberty to talk about them in the way that I do, because I have loved so many of them so much, right? You take Billy Paul. I haven't seen Billy Paul since 2005. That's the last time he came to Faith Assembly, rather 2004. And I'm sure people out there, Billy Paul came to Faith Assembly? Ladies and gentlemen, the Branham family played every sect off against the other, okay? That's the truth. He was going everywhere to every sect, yeah. So we all had our connections to the Branham family, even though we didn't have connections to each other. The Branham family played all sides against the middle in order to stay at the top, okay? That's really the truth of what they were doing. But you're right. We're gonna dive back today, John. We have a really interesting episode for our listeners today. The last few episodes, we've been talking about the big 4 issues that caused the first major schism in the message after William Branham's death. And so far, we've already talked about how the message divided into 2 factions before William Branham died. They're already divided over the issue of implementing private rooms for the gifts of the Spirit. And then when William Branham died, Lee Vale and Perry Green, with the support of Billy Paul, they launched really the return ministry beliefs. So I put those 3 as the chiefly most responsible men. Your grandfather came along as well to help with it, John. And that belief was essentially that William Branham would raise from the dead to fulfill his unfinished prophecies. Now, some of them walked that back in later years. They certainly did. But at the time William Branham died, that was a common belief. I have them all on recording, sharing that more or less openly in the years after William Branham died. I mean, there's no doubt that they were all fully on board at that point. In that period of time, that then became the second layer of disagreement. The return ministry became the second layer of disagreement between the two factions of the message. And in general, though that broke down, the return ministry beliefs broke down roughly along the same lines as the pro-church order and anti-church order groups. Okay, there was some outliers there, but for the most part, that's how it broke down at first. And so today, we're going to take a look at the third big issue that fed into the first major message schism. So we're talking about the Branham Tabernacle has all quit multiple times over the years, John. you know that as well as I do. You talked about how when your grandfather left and a lot of people left. I actually have a whole chapter in my book, John, where I examine those things. But when you think back through history, the Branham Tabernacle has not been a consistent congregation. I would say the Branham Tabernacle has been essentially 4 different congregations over the years. There have been 4 major events. If you go all the way back to the 30s, 4 major events where almost all of the tabernacle congregation left, or the overwhelming majority left, and a new congregation was imported. Okay, so what we're talking about today, I think would be the third of those events, right? Your grandfather leaving being a fourth that happened in around 2017. But anyways, today we're looking back at that. This is the third issue on that list, and I think this one and our next episode, John, we're probably going to dive into different aspects of this a little bit, is my hope. But my family was at the tabernacle through all of this. Okay, so my family was eyewitnesses to this whole period as well. I know your family was actually in Arizona when these pieces were going on, but then came back on the tail end of it. So we kind of, between our families, we have witnesses from both sides of this thing all the way through, right? So my family tells me too, John, and this is another thing. I have tried really hard to pinpoint the exact date that what we're going to talk about happened today. And I so appreciate all of the wonderful feedback we're getting from the message community over this stuff, John, the ex-message community, I should say, because you're right. Like, so much of this is we each have pieces of our history. Some of us have different versions of our history, and we're all trying to piece together what happened, right? And I'm always appreciative when people reach out with what they're aware of, what they know of, and try to compare it. And I just want to give an example of what I've tried to do, even before we did these podcasts. So, like, my own family, who sat through these events, they tell me these events happened in December of 1967. December of 1966. That's what my family tells me. I have events on tape, though, things on tape that seem to point to them happening in January of 1967. It's like a month after December. Okay? But almost every other person I've talked to about this tells me this happened in February of 1966. So which is it? Did it happen in February of 66? Did it happen in December of 66, or did it happen in January 67? And there's evidence which kind of would put you into all of those different places. So I've went, though, with February 66 because that is what the overwhelming majority of people I've talked to about told me this is when this happened. But I want to just throw out there, I have my own family says it happened in December of 66, and I have some stuff on tape that would point me to February of 67, okay? Or rather, January of 67. So anyways, let me tell about this. And anyone out in the audience, if you can help us pin these dates down a little better, feel free to reach out. So I'm going to just go with the February 66 date through this. And that would be just 2 months after William Branham died. And that would be before he was buried. Remember, he was buried in April. They held his body from the grave. They didn't bury him for months on end. They put his body in the attic at Coote's funeral home. And in April finally buried him. And as that's happening, the fight over the return ministry beliefs have already started. You had all the preachers out in Arizona, like Perry Green, like Doug McHughes, like your grandpa Willard Collins, like Leo Mercer. Then some of the preachers down south, like Earl Martin and Jack Palmer and J.T. Parnell and Paul Brewer and Lee Vale here in the Midwest. They were all really, they would have been the majority of message preachers at that time, and they were all initially supporting the return ministry ideas, okay? And then on the other side, you have Orman Neville rallying a minority of the preachers to oppose return ministry. And on his side was Raymond Jackson, and gradually the entire message preachers around in Jeffersonville all ended up supporting Orman Neville pretty quickly. Don Ruddle switched over, James Allen, Estill Beeler, and then on down south you had Bill Paderas, Ernest Fulcher. They all start supporting Ernest Fulcher's position and start rejecting return ministry. And so while that big disagreement over return ministry was unfolding, there started to be a fight for control over the Branham Tabernacle. Because at that point in time, the Deity cult had mostly all left Jeffersonville for Arizona. There weren't many of them left here. And the local message community here around Jeffersonville was siding very strongly with Orman Neville. And at first, John, it really looked like the Deity cult and the return ministry people were going to lose control of the Branham Tabernacle. That was the direction things were headed right there, in the immediate aftermath of William Branham's death. And as that unfolded, Billy Paul pulled a really corrupt maneuver, okay? Billy Paul organized a large number of people from Arizona to come back here to Jeffersonville, something like a couple hundred people. And I believe that he paid their trips, from what I've heard, with funds out of the William Branham Evangelistic Association, which he was already had got control of by that first. He never told the local community here in Jeffersonville what he was doing, and he held an impromptu midweek service at the Branham Tabernacle. Never told people what he was doing. And in that service, he held an election, and the congregation voted Billy Paul as pastor and general overseer of the Branham Tabernacle in that meeting. And it was mostly people who had moved to Arizona who voted him in, and they mostly all went back to Arizona later that same week. So they basically came back to Jeffersonville, they voted Billy Paul in as pastor, and then they left. And they never got permission from the Tabernacle Church Board to hold the vote, but after the fact, Billy Paul convinced the Deity cult members of the church board to accept the vote, and it was more or less a done deal. They never advertised the vote to the local message community when it happened, and it was really just a purely corrupt tactic of Billy Paul to get his hands on power over the tabernacle. And when it happened, I'm going to say I believe it was February 1966, but possibly December of 66 or possibly January of 67. And this started the third big issue that was going to lead up to the schism that would finally break the message into its first two sects.
What's really funny about this, Charles, is while you were investigating your research into the history from the death of William Branham forward, I have been researching from my family backward, and I've been doing this for years. So when we met each other, 2-3 years ago, we started combining notes and research, and the two pieces of the puzzle kind of began to fit, and I began to understand what was going on. Some of this we talked about in our first series that we did, but I want to not to say too much about where we're headed with this podcast, but I want to give some of the highlights of what I found in my research because it actually supports and confirms what you have found in yours. So when I began researching all of this, one of the things that I discovered that was confusing to me, I was going through all of the courthouse records in the Jeffersonville courthouse downtown, and you can find the church documents. And they list, the deacons, trustees, etc. You can find, anybody can go to the courthouse and request these records. So I did. Well, I found out that my grandfather's church, the head pastor was William Branham. And in my mind, because I've been so conditioned to think the name William Branham associated to the prophet, I thought, well, this is really odd, man. That guy is dead. How can the dead guy be the pastor? And I kind of discounted that. I set it off to the side and I said, this is really weird. They're organized under the dead guy. And I assumed that was correct. But later on, I discovered Sarah Branham's letter, wherein she talks about before William Branham was even dead, there was a lot of things happening with Billy Paul. And Billy Paul, who his name is William Paul Branham, also has the name William Branham. And so then I began to think, okay, this is starting to make a little bit of sense, but I'm still kind of piecing it together, right? So I go back to the courthouse, and I find that the Branham brothers are claiming their houses as parsonage. and they're not the pastor of the tabernacle. My grandfather is, according to what they're telling the people. And I thought, this can't be. This is not quite legal, right? And that's whenever all hell broke loose, man. I published the documents. The deacons had contacted me before they went to the courthouse. They wanted to know how to find these documents. So while I'm out of the cult and I'm very vocal about William Branham being a false prophet, etc., these people who are still in the cult, the leadership, are contacting me. I told them how to go find the documents. They did. And that's what led to the church split. And not to go too far with this because there's more of the story, but if you go to my website and you type in resignation of the pastor, just type in resignation on the website, you'll find the testimonies by the deacons and the trustees, basically all of them pointing fingers at the Branham family. And it gets really odd what they're pointing their fingers to, which I'll talk about later in this episode. But all of this to say, and to turn it back to you to set the stage, things were not as they seemed. And whenever William Branham died, here's the key concept that you have to understand. When William Branham died, after having preached for so many years that the rapture's coming, his little tiny sect were the elite Christians and they would be raptured away, he dies. And the leadership were not focused on the rapture, Charles. They were focused on controlling the asset, and the asset was the people.
You are exactly right. The what was happening among the leaders from his death to his burial, those few months, was Billy Paul and the Deity cult seizing control of all the central institutions of the message. That is exactly what was happening through that period of time. And as we're going to do full episodes. We'll do a full episode on each of the different individual institutions, I hope, of the message, John. I think we're going to do episodes on every one of the lieutenants of William Branham. I mean, we've got lots and lots of episodes we're going to do. We'll do full episodes on Perry Green and everything, I promise, okay? So just be patient with us. We will work our way through it all. But as it relates here today, yeah, I mean, Billy Paul, from the very beginning, after his father died, he consistently used corrupt maneuvers to hold on to power over the message community and over the message institutions especially. And as we go through these episodes over the next month, there are several more instances of this I'm sure we can highlight pretty good for people. But Billy Paul's someone who played dirty. He played dirty a lot, and through that, I'll say he overthrew several churches the same way over the years. The Branham Tabernacle in '66 was not the only time Billy Paul did this. This was a pattern for Billy Paul to bring a large group of people from out of town to do a hostile church takeover. And if he thought he had a right to the church for whatever reason, through his father's ministry, that's exactly what they did. And he did that quite a number of times, to be honest. In my opinion, I think that's what they did to the Tucson Tabernacle after Perry Green died, right? That's my opinion of what happened there. And I could point out other churches today, but I won't, that they did the same thing to over the years. And so I want to point out to you, this was a common tactic used by the main sect of the message over the years to keep control of properties and assets and other churches, because the message, it doesn't have a corporate structure, like a corporate overarching structure, right? So there's no way for the central institution to really legally enforce any sort of discipline, right? This is how they would do it, right? They would bring in a bunch of people, they'd have a vote, and they'd just basically hostile takeover. And so when Billy Paul did this to the Branham Tabernacle in, I'm saying February of '66, let me tell you that pretty well everyone here in Jeffersonville was absolutely outraged. Absolutely outraged, okay? First of all, they were outraged because Billy Paul basically stole the position from Orman Neville, okay? He stole Orman Neville's position, who was the most senior minister in the message when he did that, okay? Orman Neville was the pastor. Most of the people really liked him. And Billy Paul wasn't just taking over the Branham Tabernacle, but he was kicking Orman Neville to the curb when he did that. So he was stealing an elderly man's income from him. It was really dirty, and the people were very outraged here, okay? Now, the people out in Arizona who ended up coming back and populating the tabernacle in years after, you guys just don't know about this stuff, okay? I mean, that's just the truth of it, because everybody who knew was outraged and quit, right? So This act led to a whole lot of families to leave the Branham Tabernacle, including my own family, John, including my own family. And back then, probably the richest family in the message community back then was the Dow family. They had a vast business empire. They were part of the full gospel businessmen, okay? And they intervened when this happened, when Billy Paul took over the tabernacle. And they took up for Orman Neville. They tried to mediate this thing. They told Billy Paul that if he would keep Orman Neville on as pastor, right? They're trying to patch the whole thing up and keep it from exploding. They told him if they would keep Orman Neville on as his assistant pastor, more or less, they would give a big endowment to the Branham Tabernacle to fund his salary. And so that deal was made with Billy Paul. The full gospel businessman, through the Dow family, gave the Branham Tabernacle a very large, basically a bribe, to keep Orman Neville on as pastor. And then Billy Paul kept him on as pastor in order to get that big endowment, okay? So it's a very strange situation here in 1966, 1967. Billy Paul wants to get rid of Orman Neville. Orman Neville has majority support here in Jeffersonville. And basically, Billy Paul was bribed with a large amount of money to not drop the stick of dynamite on the whole thing, get rid of Orman Neville. And so even though they don't like each other, you end up with this really strange situation where Billy Paul is the official pastor of the Branham Tabernacle, but Orman Neville is doing all the preaching, and Billy Paul basically leaves Jeffersonville and goes back to Arizona. And that is how the situation remains at the Branham Tabernacle for several years.
And where it gets really odd, and I'm trying not to jump ahead. There's just so much to untangle here. Many people contacted me after I left, and they discussed their distaste with my grandfather, mistakenly thinking that I was upset with my grandfather. Because as you know, Charles, whenever I began to research and publish information, the Branham family tried to do a character assassination on me, and they tried to say that I was disgruntled against my grandfather, and so I did all of this, which isn't true. My grandfather was, like you said, he's my hero. He was my grandfather. I loved my grandfather. But they contacted me, and they were trying to express their distaste for my grandfather stealing the church from Orman Neville. And at that time, I didn't know any different. I assumed, well, maybe Grandpa did. I didn't know. But I didn't join in the smear campaign against my grandfather because he's my grandfather. It was unfortunate the way that picture was painted. But where it gets really weird, and we're going to get into this some in this episode, but more in the future. What happened with Billy Paul and Orman Neville, that scenario, that setup where Orman Neville he's basically a puppet figure for the Branham Tabernacle. My grandfather became Orman Neville's replacement puppet figure, and my grandfather knew it. That's where it gets really weird and hard for me to understand my grandfather's mentality, why he did this. I'll never understand. But you can go listen to his testimony. He's clearly upset with Joseph Branham in his testimony. He doesn't call out Billy Paul. And honestly, at the time I heard him give his resignation speech, I wasn't yet fully understanding that Billy Paul had control of the tabernacle. I thought my grandfather did. But he resigned, and I have witnesses who were very close to what happened after the resignation. My grandfather remained really close to Billy Paul, and there wasn't this rift between those two guys. There was a rift between my grandfather and Joseph, I believe. But my grandfather was the puppet figure, and he had half of the assets. Because in the Branham Tabernacle, as we discussed, we had this clear split of people. There were three categories, basically. But half of those people in those three categories were on my grandfather's side. The other half were on the Branham side. So whenever my grandfather started his church, he got half of the assets, which are the people. And the collaboration between the two men after this split is unusual because for all appearances, they should have hated each other from the things that my grandfather said. But after I began to understand Billy Paul controlled the tabernacle, my grandfather was the puppet figure, and he knew that he was the puppet figure. He was working directly with Billy Paul. And the whole thing, for me, from all appearances, it looks like it was orchestrated.
So, John, it's probably natural to wonder how Billy Paul got away with this hostile takeover of Branham Tabernacle in February 1966. But the answer is pretty simple. Okay, before William Branham died, he installed members of the Deity cult on the Branham Tabernacle Church Board. And several of the people out in Arizona, like your grandpa, were still board members of the Branham Tabernacle even while they were out in Arizona. Okay, and so when William Branham died, everyone on the Tabernacle Church Board was in the Deity cult except Banks Woods. Okay. Not only that, several of the deacons at Branham Tabernacle were also in the Deity cult, and Branham left just enough of them behind to have control of the church board, okay, under the Deity cult. So the deacons who were not in the Deity cult, they all ended up coming to my church when all this was said and done, John, because they just, shocked. And Banks Wood, as we'll talk about, he quits and he leaves. Basically, everyone who was not in the Deity cult in a position of leadership at the Branham Tabernacle quit before all this was said and done and went to other churches. So basically, Billy Paul was able to get away with this because the Deity cult supported him, and because they were the majority of the Branham Tabernacle Church Board. So there was really nothing anybody could do about it, right? And they had all the levers of power under their control. And so it led to some really ugly problems that eventually caused the schism in 1968. And we're going to, in our next episode, John, we're going to talk through that last thing in the actual schism that happens in 68. Okay. And that really lines up with when your grandfather came back to town. Okay. And the events leading up to that. But that's essentially what happened. As far as providing the board members, as far as proving the board members were in the Deity cult, that's not very hard to do. You can find either on tape or in their testimonies or in Only Believe magazine, besides Banks Woods, you can find every other member of the Branham Tabernacle board saying somewhere on record that William Branham was God in the flesh. They all said it publicly at one time or another, and we have shared quotes from them, I believe from all of them in past episodes and prior episodes of the podcast. And I have quotes for them all in my book too, if you want direct quotations from them, all calling William Branham God. And so the message people here in Jeffersonville, they figured out what Billy Paul had done, and they really pitched a fit when it happened. And I'll tell you, it was loud yelling. It was all of that, okay? And they wanted to get the church board to invalidate the election for pastor because Billy Paul had violated the church bylaws when he had the election without first getting the approval of the board and advertising it to the people. Like, all that was required. But Banks Woods, he takes the lead of the charge on this to try and get the church board to reverse the election, basically. And Banks Woods at that time he had basically been functioning as the treasurer of the tabernacle since William Branham had moved to Arizona. So he's like the treasurer when he was out of town. And then Banks Woods, this is also something people may not realize. Banks Woods was running the franchise that became Spoken Word Publications at that time too. Banks Woods was the head of what would turn into Spoken Word Publications, in addition to being trustee of the Branham Tabernacle. So Banks Woods was a very important figure, okay? And a whole lot of people here in Jeffersonville and him were very outraged that Billy Paul, more so that he had overthrown Orman Neville more than anything else. It was really the way he mistreated Orman Neville that really was the worst side of this to them, right? It wasn't so much that they were trying to take over, but it was the way that they mistreated Orman Neville through the whole process that really outraged the people the most, okay? And besides that, honestly, Billy Paul had truly just totally ran over the local message community when he did what he did. And so for the people that came into the message after all of this happened, which is 99.99% of people in the message, okay? I think it's really important to recognize really the total disrespect and the utter disdain that was shown through this period to the longtime followers of William Branham here in Jeffersonville. These were the people who had been dedicated to William Branham, some of them going all the way back to the 1930s, from the earliest days, right? Billy Paul and the people in Arizona just literally ran them over, ignored them, acted like they didn't matter, and just took control, right? And you don't like it? Screw you. I mean, that is exactly what happened, okay? And Banks Woods tried to get the church board to throw the election out, but the Deity cult members refused to go along with him. They backed Billy Paul, and they accepted the correct vote. And so Billy Paul became pastor of the Branham Tabernacle. And when all was said and done, Banks Woods resigned from the church board. He quit the Branham Tabernacle, and he eventually left the message altogether. And I actually have a recording of Banks Woods' resignation speech, John. And I want to share that, experts of that, here with you, John. And in this, you can pick up how he feels about what Billy Paul did. And in this, Banks Woods is basically telling the people that he believes Orman Neville had the power to go over the church board, override the church board, because he had been specially ordained by William Branham, right? Banks Woods' argument is basically William Branham made Banks Woods the pastor, therefore the board, what God has put in place, let not man take apart. That's Banks Woods' argument through here. And so you can play some of these experts, John. I'll give you the full audio clip from his resignation speech, and our listeners can listen to that. You can put it up on the website. You can get the transcript up there on the website, and people can read the whole thing for themselves.
The reason I stand before you this morning, people put me in the trustee board, and I feel led this morning to come and tell you all. You put me in, but I step out because I'm forced to do what I have to do. You don't answer for me. I stand alone with God. This is an individual affair, and you can't answer for me. And I ain't doing to ask no one what to do. I step out alone, stepping out and quitting, resigning, all signing in checks on the trustee board. I resigned. Done already resigned. And so I feel a load going from me this morning. I walked with a prophet along the way. I've done everything I could, pleasing as we walked along together. Little Billy Paul should have come to the board when he announced it. I want to take to be sent to Billy Paul. That's fine. And you're supposed to go to the board when you do these things, and then go to the people. So I know who he left in charge. There he is, on tape. So believe what to take, what's on tape. So that is the Lord speaking to us. Sure. Holy Ghost coming back in the last day speaking to us. See? Now coming together with all you people, good job doing the same thing and believe in the one God placed here for the Neville to take the people. He said, take the people through. He's ordained to do it. So I say what the tape said, nothing else. Jesus Christ the same yesterday and forever. He don't change. We're the one that changed. We change. We worship idols. We worship everything. Human beings is funny creatures. Anything they can see with their eyes, they worship. But we're supposed to worship a creator that you can't see. By faith, walks right along and talks to you along the way. Not no screaming voice, still voice. Oh, God, that's wonderful, ain't it? Have a creator that you know is with you, even in you, clear to the end. Pray for me, people. I felt led to do this. Amen. Brother Neville, I turn the services.
So, Charles, that sounds much like my grandfather's resignation. And when you think about the two, how similar the two situations are, both are puppet figures. I think both knew that they were. I have to believe that Orman Neville, there came a point of time in which he had to have known that he was a puppet figure. But think about, not for my grandfather, but think about for Orman Neville, how significant this is. Because the entire world, when you hear the name William Branham, they think of the dead guy. But the way things are being set up, William Branham isn't the dead guy. William Branham is the dead guy's son. And so as they're establishing, this is quite a con when you really think about it. As they're establishing this thing, to the people of the congregation, they can clearly, openly say, William Branham is our pastor, do you agree? And I have actually heard my grandfather say this, Charles. William Branham is our pastor, do you agree? And everybody's amen, amen, and they're thinking about the dead guy. And so as they vote people in, they're voting in the son. As they're doing any government documentation, it's for the son. But they're all believing that they're doing it under the dead guy. It's insidious what they did, Charles.
Oh, I know just what you mean. It's dirty.
Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started? Or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support.
My family was actually sitting there when Bankswood gave his resignation speech, and then the majority of the people at the Branham Tabernacle, I can tell you, they were outraged. And you know how I know most of them were outraged, John? Because I went to church with them all because they all quit the Branham Tabernacle. They were outraged over this stuff, John. I'm telling you, okay? And as you listen through that tape, there's a loud group of people in there shouting amen, and you can tell that a large faction of the people sitting in the Branham Tabernacle are on Bankwood's side, and that they're not happy with what has happened. And so what happened over the next 2 years after that, the majority of the tabernacle abandoned the Branham Tabernacle, and the majority of the congregation left there. In 1967 and 1968, they mostly left. I'll say 80%. They left, and they started going to other message churches here in Jeffersonville. And when you add that on top of the people who already moved to Arizona, and the people who had already left over church order, the tabernacle congregation got really small in those years, got very small. The tabernacle basically collapsed through all of this, and it took a few years for the congregation to build back up. And this is another pattern that people will see as we go through this. Whenever there's major church collapses like this, and somehow they manage to survive, they have a tactic to import a new congregation through mission work or what have you. We'll talk about what some of that looks like in later episodes. And starting next week, John, in our next episode, we're going to talk through, I think, exactly what it looked like as the situation deteriorated and led up to the schism in 1968. But what happened is basically that Orman Neville, John, so your grandpa was a puppet, like from the beginning. He agreed to become a puppet, right? Not so Orman Neville. Orman Neville was having this forced on him, okay? And Orman Neville was not having it, okay? And in his sermons at the Branham Tabernacle, when Billy Paul is his pastor, okay, officially, Orman Neville started preaching against the Deity cult. He started preaching against the return ministry. He started preaching even against Billy Paul in his sermons, John. There's one recording of Orman Neville where he basically says Billy Paul is Judas in the sermon at the Branham Tabernacle, okay? And these recordings, ladies and gentlemen, are around. The old timers have them. I have some recordings. I have a lot of these as well myself, okay? And there's tapes for all of this. The tapes are still around. And I've listened through some of them as I, put these pieces together for my book. And so as all of that unfolds, some of the people accusing Orman Neville, some of the people start accusing Orman Neville of getting senile, okay? That's kind of their spin on it. Oh, Orman Neville's getting senile, right? And that's what the rumor that starts to go around. And that lasts about a year, okay? It lasts about a year. And then William Branham, Billy Paul, William Branham II, okay, sends a man named Vernon Mann. Vernon Mann's a man one of the preachers who had moved out to Arizona with William Branham. Billy Paul sends Vernon Mann back here to more or less get Orman Neville under control. Vernon Mann comes back. I've got his tapes from when he preached at Branham Tabernacle, and you can hear him trying to do it. He was unsuccessful, okay? Vernon Mann couldn't get the job done. So Vernon Mann goes back to Arizona, and then finally, Billy Paul, his second attempt to get Orman Neville under control, he sends your grandfather, John, and we'll get into that in our next episode. But Orman Neville just kept pushing ahead, and that's when Billy Paul finally sent your grandfather back as really the third attempt to enforce his control on Branham Tabernacle. And your grandfather did a much better job. So we'll talk about that in our next episode. But I know for today, I want to especially draw attention to the fact that Billy Paul, when he took over, he ran over half the message community to do it, right? I know that like the sect of the message you come from all think, they all think that they were the majority of the message. No. You here in Jeffersonville, they were like 20% when this happened. Absolutely not, right? And and in the whole universe of message churches, they were only about 50%. They were not the majority. They were barely half, okay? And they totally ran over the other half, right? And so there is a parallel message community that started out just as big as the main sect, John, that went on and has produced a whole other side of the message with thousands and thousands of people in hundreds of churches, right? That are in line with the sect of the message I came from. Okay, so we'll talk through that as the episodes come. But there's a whole other side of the message, different from the main sect, from these events, right? Who still believe William Branham as Elijah, who still that whole path of stuff. And we got a lot of the original message missionaries came out of this, like Levi Larson, right? There's so many preachers we could go through that ended up coming over onto the other side of this, including a good chunk of the overseas missionaries that left over this as well. That's how it's come. Like the sect of the message, the sect I come from, we started out with the International Missionary Network, because even the International Missionary Network split over this stuff. Okay, so anyways, the people were really outraged how Orman Neville got treated through all of this. And it was like Billy Paul was being rude to him for no good reason. And back then, as I said, Orman Neville was the most senior minister in the message, and that carried a lot of weight. And the way he was treated so disrespectfully by Billy Paul outraged people. And when that happened, right, that was originally, when all this happened, with the Billy Paul takeover, at first, this was just kind of contained here to Jeffersonville, okay? It just kind of affected the people here locally. But with the way Billy Paul disrespected Orman Neville, that did the most damage, John. And I would say that because Orman Neville was kind of the leader of this whole other faction of the message, right? That was rejecting return ministry, that was rejecting all that. And as they're disrespecting him as the senior figure, people are starting at this point to realize the Deity cult survived. This is when Raymond Jackson and Bill Paderis and all these guys start waking up. And this is when they start to realize, the Deity cult survived, okay? They had went underground in 1961 because, when William Branham preached the bruised serpent, and they thought it had been destroyed. But as all this unfolds, the other side of things are starting to figure out, oh no, the Deity cult survived. And not only have they survived, they have taken over the central institutions, and even worse, Billy Paul is on their side. And gradually, the whole situation caused the early message preachers aligned with Orman Neville and that side of things to gradually lose their confidence in the central institutions of the message, because it was obvious that the central institutions, they were not being fair, right? It was obvious something corrupt was going on with Billy Paul and the trustees, right? And so that loss of trust in the central institutions was a big contributor to this whole thing. And to be clear, after Banks Woods resigned, after that, every member of all of the boards of all of the central institutions from then on was controlled by the Deity cult. The Deity cult has controlled every board on the central institutions since then. The William Branham Evangelistic Association, the Branham Tabernacle, the franchise that eventually became Spoken Word Publications, the franchise that eventually became Voice of God Recordings. Every single one of their trustees was in the Deity cult. And it was William Branham who put them all into power before he died, right? And so that's what's happened as Billy Paul takes over. The faction who's going to break away and start their own new message sect, they're discovering the Deity cult has control of the central institutions. They're discovering Billy Paul is on their side and that they're abusing their power to run over everybody else. And then they did what they did to Orman Neville and the local community here in Jeffersonville.
And to the listeners who were never part of this, but you're curious about how the NAR, the charismatic movement, all of these things developed, think of the gravity of what was just said. The Deity cult is in control. So every single time, Charles, that you see one of these NAR figures who says that they came and visited the Branham Tabernacle, I can name like 5 that have been saying this thing. 2 of them contacted me. I mean, that's how weird this is. They're visiting the Deity cult. And when you really think about the implications of that, what they're teaching whenever they revere William Branham in this way, they're giving him the same respect as the people in the Deity cult. So the Deity cult was in control, and the NAR has what they've developed as this persona from William Branham. It's the Deity cult version of William Branham. It's not it's not even the latter rain version of William Branham. That's how weird this is. But also think about, This cult was an authoritarian controlled cult. It had a pyramid structure of authoritarian control. You can study Dr. Stephen Hassan's bite model and his pyramid of authoritarian control. You can see those images, etc., on the web. This was a cult who were trained to believe that they didn't have a general overseer, and they did. It was behind the scenes. William Branham was the general overseer. But they've been trained to be like this, right? So you had this, when William Branham died, you had this weird thing happen. All of the ministers who truly believed that they weren't a cult, that they did not have a central figure, they tried to implement a continuation of a cult without a central figure, which cannot be done. Billy Paul was the only one who was smart enough to realize, well, my dad was the general overseer. Now somebody has to take his place to hold all this together. I will step up as the general overseer. And there's so much to unpack here. Like it's going to take the rest of the series for us to unpack how complicated this is with Billy Paul. But I can remember, Charles, back when I was in the cult, I was with Billy Paul at one of the National Quartet conventions, which I'm a musician, as everybody knows. I love music. Back then, I loved explicitly Southern gospel music. That's all I listened to, as did Billy Paul. And I'm with Billy Paul, and he walks right up to one of the older groups that I really, really liked and respected. I'm not going to give their name. And Billy Paul knows them by first name. They know him by first name. These guys know Billy Paul. And it shocked me because at that time, I did not realize how big this message cult was. I didn't realize it was connected to latter rain, all of this. But these guys knew him. And now, in hindsight, that's a piece of the puzzle that's very important. When William Branham died, you remember, as we've discussed what happened right after, you had other movements spin off trying to leverage the assets, which were the people. You had the shepherding movement spin off, which, William Branham's partner, Ern Baxter, was a big part of that. You had all of this together. Well, Billy Paul, not only does he control the assets, which are the people of the cult, and he's gaining more control of this as it's happening, well, he has also the added complexity of having been under the fame of being William Branham's son and knows all of these people. And I kind of feel like, Charles, you may differ with me, but I kind of feel like he was going to miss that after William Branham died. So the reasons why he's taking over isn't just for the assets, which that's a large part of it, but also the fame, because if he's the general overseer, now he's still the respected leader of all of this weird movement. And I kind of see it unfolding as this big complex picture. To try to unravel this it's going to take several episodes, Charles.
You're right, it is complex. And I do have some thoughts on that I'll share before we get done today, for sure. Now, as you think about these years, 1966, 1967, while the message community is having all this infighting, this is happening at the same time they're still grappling with the fallout of William Branham's death. These are really bad years for the message. The message community is shrinking every single year through this, right? They're hemorrhaging people all the way through this. I would say, based on what I know, it just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller until 1968. Like every year, this thing's shrinking from 65, 66, 67, 68. When that big schism happens, then on the other side of that, the big missionary push happens. Because this thing turns into millions of people, right? It goes from these few thousand we're talking about to millions, okay? And so the trend of shrinking didn't really change until 68. But I look forward to talking about how that missionary outreach happened. We'll do some more episodes on that. But another thing worth pointing out today, I think, is that the broader latter rain movement had awareness of what we're describing today, right? At this point in time, 1966, about 1/3 of the senior leaders of the Full Gospel Businessmen were message followers. Let me say that again. In 1966, 1/3 of the senior leadership of the Full Gospel Businessmen were message followers. Okay? And I think a lot of people miss that. The Full Gospel Businessmen was its own entity, but 1/3 of their senior leaders were in the message in 1966. And it stayed that way into the 1970s. And I want to do a full episode on on at least a full episode on the Full Gospel Businessman somewhere down the road where we can talk about all that. But the Full Gospel Businessmen were fully aware of what was going on because they overlapped so much with the message. And that's how they intervened through the Dow family, John, to give the endowment to the Branham Tabernacle. They were trying to be the mediators to help patch everything up. And if the Full Gospel Businessmen knew what was going on, you can be sure that the senior leaders across the latter reign were also aware of what was going on. I've heard stories that Kenneth Hagin intervened directly with Orlando Walker while this was going on. And Kenneth Hagin actually played a role getting Orlando Walker to give up return ministry beliefs. I've heard that story. It's just a story, but it was passed around my sect of the message as common knowledge. I also heard a similar thing about Tommy Osborne with another person, another preacher in my sect of the message. And besides that, I also know for sure that Joseph Matson Bose got involved. Joseph Lee Vale actually talks about it on tape. He was leaning on Lee Vale through this period of time. And Lee Vale and Joseph Matson Bose actually had their falling out during this period of time, all related to this stuff. And you have to remember, at this stage, most all the churches involved in the message were affiliated with independent assemblies of God. And Joseph Matson Bose and A.W. Rasmussen, depending on the year, they were the general superintendent of independent assemblies of God. And John and Earl Martin were independent assemblies of God ministers. So was Doug McHughes. Lee Vale was operating under their auspices back then, right? And Joseph Matson Bose absolutely got directly involved in this stuff when it happened. And so it's important to remember that through this period of time, 1966, 1967, 1968, message preachers were still having their articles published in Herald of Faith, right? And all the doors to the broader latter rain movement were still open to them as all of this is going on. And there's an awareness in there that all this is happening. And as this schism unfolds, what Billy Paul was doing, the back and forth over the return ministry business, all this craziness was absolutely leaking out to the broader movement. And it was just creating a really complex situation where the message was splintering into two factions. And at the same time, you got one faction that's drifting further away from the mainstream of the latter rain movement, while the other faction is kind of glad to receive support from the rest of the latter rain movement to kind of back them up and reinforce them, right? And so that's all happening, because of pressure from men like Joseph Matson Bose and churches from the mainstream of the movement. So it is a very complex situation, right? It's not like this simple, take a line, write it down the middle, and you got this division. It's not that simple. It is complicated, where there's different influences playing, and you end up with people with different flavors. Some end up with a soft flavor. Take return ministry. You've got the side where the people are, there is absolutely no chance of William Branham's coming back any way, shape, or form, all the way to the other side. Yes, he was Jesus. He'll raise from the dead. You got that. But then you've got variants. You've got shades in between, right? The same with the the church order, right? You got all the way on the end. You got cessationist, all the way over to the full on. Let's do the latter rain stuff forever. And you have shades in between. And so the message community has the two extremes, but some of the people are finding middle ground in there. And all this is eventually going to translate into what we see when they go out and start doing their mission stuff.
It's like a Baskin-Robbins 31 flavors of cult mess, man. And when you think about the history, people today ask me why no two message cult sects can, fellowship with one another. Well, if you think about the history of this, man, they've never been able to. They've always been at each other's throats since William Branham died. And I think as we get together and put our heads together through the history that has happened after William Branham died, I think people will understand why that is and why that is so important when you think about how it affects the broader movement. Because many of these, we're talking in the early years after William Branham's death, and I know that when you think the Branham cult, you're thinking of the years closer to now, where they're so isolated, they're kind of in their own world. But back after William Branham died, it was a much different picture. The latter rain movement had spread abroad, and the charismatic movement was developing. The names you mentioned, Kenneth Hagin, T.L. Osborne, these guys are big into the prosperity gospel. Oral Roberts was very close to William Branham. And they're all in this weird mindset of, what happened? Our Elijah just died. This was the man that we believe was God in the flesh. What happened? And so everybody is trying to figure this out, and everybody's not quite coming to the same conclusions. And it just turned into such a mess. But very, very glad to go through that, and I'm excited for the next episodes.
Me too. There's one last thing I want to point out, make sure I get to our listeners today. And you've already drawn attention to this, and it's this. The official pastor of the Branham Tabernacle from February of 1966 all the way up to 2017, the official pastor of the Branham Tabernacle was William Paul Branham. Okay? William Branham, Billy Paul. He never preached. Really? He never led a service. He wasn't even around most of the time, right? But he was the official pastor of the church. And Billy Paul wasn't a preacher, right? At least none of the people I ever knew in the message ever considered Billy Paul a preacher. I tell you, my sect of the message, we never considered Billy Paul a preacher, John. And it goes back to a lot of this stuff. He was a usurper to our sect of the message, okay? And in fact, in the message, he was a divorced man, right? Divorced people aren't allowed to be preachers in the message, are they, John?
No, they're not.
Okay. So he's not even allowed to be a preacher in the message, but he's the pastor of Branham Tabernacle? What in the world? And so this hostile takeover of Branham Tabernacle, John, you got to just put yourself in the picture back there. You had a man who wasn't a preacher, who was divorced, who basically seized power and became the secret pastor of the Branham Tabernacle for over 50 years. And although Orman, Neville, and your grandpa after him, they functioned as pastor of Branham Tabernacle, officially, they were always just the assistant pastor to Billy Paul. Billy Paul was always the pastor. And over time, it seemed like the average person at Branham Tabernacle, like you mentioned, they forgot or they were unaware of the situation. But every year, when it came around time to re-elect pastor, the Branham Tabernacle congregation every time would vote for William Branham as pastor, right? Like that was the election for pastor at Branham Tabernacle. We're electing William Branham as pastor and Willard Collins as assistant pastor. And a lot of people more or less thought they were voting for William Branham, the dead, late William Branham, as honorary pastor. That is really what they thought they were doing. I've met people that thought they were doing. I've heard people say that that's what they thought they were doing. But that is not what they were doing, okay? That's what they thought they were doing. But the person they were actually voting for was William Paul Branham, William Branham's son. And so few people realized that what was going on. I want to tell you, John, my sect of the message, we always knew, right? Because that's why we left, That's why our families left all those years ago. We always knew. But the truth was, William Paul Branham was actually being elected pastor at Branham Tabernacle, not his father. And I got to be honest here. I don't know what's worse. Okay, I don't know what's worse. The fact that people thought they were voting for a dead man to be their pastor, or the fact that Billy Paul was using smoke and mirrors, just that whole thing with smoke and mirrors for Billy Paul to stay in control. Which is worse, John? Which is worse? It's like it makes your head explode. It's like it's so sad, honestly.
Yeah.
Like I don't even know what to say about that. And I think just getting that picture in your mind is a really good illustration for how Billy Paul operated through the years, okay? Billy Paul was more or less content to stay in the background most of the time, so long as he could keep his hands on the levers of power, as long as the money kept flowing, as long as he was, in control of the central institutions. He was more or less content to stay in the background, right? And let his lieutenants do all the, get all the face time, right? Most of the face time, we'll say it like that. But Billy Paul, make no mistake, Billy Paul was the man running the central institutions of the message from 1966 up to the early 2000s. And Joseph Branham was working for him. Joseph wasn't in charge. Don't be fooled about that either. Joseph was not running this. No, absolutely not. We'll talk about that in detail later. Joseph didn't start really taking a real position in leadership until the 1990s, okay? So the truth is, Billy Paul was the central leader of the main sect of the message from the time his father died up until certainly the 1990s, and I would say really into the early 2000s. But he just stayed in the background and ran things quietly. And the truth is that over and over and over again, Billy Paul lied, he cheated, he stole, and he was doing that literally from the month his father died in order to take control and keep control. We'll talk more about it in future episodes.
It was a Penn and Teller show. I don't know if you're familiar with that comedy act, but there's Penn and Teller. One of them is silent, and you look at him, and there's this boisterous big guy. Well, Teller is the silent one, and he is the one who's really the brains behind all the comedy routines. But Teller's the one that gets all the credit because he's the vocal one. That's what Billy Paul and Joseph were. It was a Penn and Teller show. And you're right. Billy Paul had control, and for me, like I said, I had so many mixed emotions over this. I should be mad at what they did, but it's so funny. I can't help but laugh at it. I was the scapegoat, Charles. Whenever all of this was about to break, they realized that I had discovered that this whole thing was a con from the beginning, but they didn't know how much I knew. And so what they did, they tried to assassinate my character by saying that I had a vendetta against my grandfather, and therefore I was targeting the Branham Tabernacle. They weren't telling the people that Billy Paul is the one running it. And so it's this big con, right? And that, because they threw that distraction up as a red herring, my mind went there instead of to what they were wanting me not to find, which we eventually did. But I should be mad, but Charles, it's so funny to think all of these people for all of these years were completely conned, and Billy Paul was the guy running the whole show. And it makes so much sense when you think about all of these different sects and how, I don't know if you remember it, but back whenever they were all kind of really separating from each other, they put out this big false front where they're bringing in all of the different groups together and saying, we like the, I can't even remember all the groups at this point, but we like the Seven Thunders group. Let's bring those in. They're God's people. And they're bringing everything together because they still want that pyramid of authoritarian control. Mm-hmm. And they wanted Billy Paul at that time to be the central figure that's running it. But anyway, we have so much. I could talk forever about all of this, and unfortunately we have more episodes to do that. So
part of me feels sorry for Billy Paul too, John. I want to tack this on too, because when Billy Paul, when his father died, I'm sure that was a very sad experience for him, right? Like if we go back in time and put ourselves in his shoes, I'm sure that situation seemed to threaten the livelihood of him and his family, right? If you think about it, him and his family, his brothers, his sisters, right? They were all living their lives working for William Branham's ministry. And William Branham's sudden and untimely death threatened to shut the whole thing down, right? The money would stop flowing. Their careers in that respect were over. And so from a purely financial situation, right, I think if we put ourselves in Billy Paul's shoes, he was going into a desperate situation when his father died, right? He wasn't just facing, oh, my father died. He was facing, oh, my father died, and our entire life and world is about to unravel. That's what, if you put yourself in his shoes, right? That's what was happening. He was facing a absolutely ruinous life event that he would probably never be able to recover from if he didn't do some of the things that he did right here, right? And so the only means they had to support themselves was through control of the central institutions of the message, right? They didn't have educations. None of them had a real job, right? And if the message shriveled up and died, well, so did their lives, basically, right? And not just, like you mentioned, their kind of fame, right? Their popularity, but their income, everything just shriveled up and died if the message died. If the message died, their financial well-being and future and careers was going up in smoke. And I truly believe that was indeed the main impetus that pushed Billy Paul to seize control. I think it was pragmatism at the end of the day for the financial well-being of his family in maintaining their lifestyle. And I think that shows over the years when you really examine the way that Billy Paul conducted himself. He primarily just conducted himself as a message cheerleader, right? He never really took any public side on any of the big issues, did he? He just kind of stayed quiet in the background and cheerled the message here and there. He was tolerant to pretty well any sect of the message, any message group, any ideas out there. He was very tolerant, just so long as they accepted William Branham as the prophet and they were willing to be subordinate to the central institutions. That's really all that mattered to Billy Paul. And right along that way, you remember Billy Paul, his reputation when William Branham died was very poor. Okay, and I know maybe for people later on in the message who grew up in the message in later years, it might be hard to recognize it. But when William Branham died, Billy Paul had a terrible reputation in the message. William Branham had totally destroyed Billy Paul's reputation because he had trashed Billy Paul over and over and over to the message community in his sermons, right? He had aired all of Billy Paul's dirty laundry to the entire message community publicly, repeatedly. And Billy Paul got, the worst of that out of anyone in his family. But William Branham did do it to everyone in his family at one point or another. But when William Branham died, Billy Paul had frankly, a bad reputation, right? William Branham had only been like 2 or 3 months later, right? When was Marriage and Divorce preached? It was preached in the summer, right? So less than 6 months before William Branham died, William Branham had publicly aired to the entire cult the marital divorce sins and everything else of Billy Paul, okay? He had basically lit Billy Paul on fire to the message community and said he's a worthless scoundrel 6 months before William Branham died, okay? So Billy Paul, when all this happens, he's not in a good place to be a unifying figure. His father has destroyed him, honestly. And I think if William Branham had not have done that, John, if William Branham had not have so savagely destroyed Billy Paul's reputation, when all of this unfolded, it would have been a whole lot different. The people would have respected Billy Paul a lot more. And I also think Billy Paul probably wouldn't have been so desperate either, right? Because it was his father's own burning his reputation to the ground that really put him in the position that the people who came after him might just cut him out, right? If his father hadn't burned his reputation so bad, he would have been in the inner circle with Orman, Neville, and the other people, and he wouldn't have went down the path he did. And I really think, John, we've got to just kind of consider that in our minds as well, because if William Branham hadn't burned his reputation, and Billy Paul had a better reputation when William Branham died, the whole thing would have turned out differently. And I really do believe Billy Paul would not have been so desperate, and he probably wouldn't have taken all of these radical steps, and he wouldn't have been at the mercy of the Deity cult, right? He would have been friends with the other the other side of things, because the other side of things didn't like him because his father had trashed him, right? And so at the end of the day, what does all this do? It brings it all back and it lays it at the feet of William Branham, right? He is the one who caused all of this.
Absolutely. And on top of all of that, as the cult is starting to implode, which that's really what was happening when Billy Paul was taking over, he realized, I think, that people would suddenly discover that this whole thing was a con, not just his con taking it over, but none of the prophecies were real. And many of the prophecies that William Branham was supposed to have been on earth whenever they happened, they hadn't yet happened. So what do you do with that? But there's a lot to unpack here. It'll take several episodes, so we'll stop it here. If you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org and christiangospelchurch.org. For more about the history of William Branham and the healing revivals, read Come Out of Her, My People, available on Amazon and Kindle. For more about the dark side of the New Apostolic Reformation, read Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR, available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.